So I did a video earlier talking about how people are kind of probably heading into the fatigue factor of the multiverse concept, mainly because of the fact that sometimes it doesn't live up to what is promised or what they feel is promised to them from the person that makes the announcement, in this case, Kevin Feige. And the movie in question being Multiverse of Madness. But check that video out. I'll provide a link to it at the end here. But speaking of Multiverse of Madness and Kevin Feige, Feige basically announced when this was happening that not only was Sam Raimi going to be the director, but it was going to have a lot of Sam Raimi's tones in it when it comes to his kind of films. Mostly the horror-themed tones, gruesome deaths, very dark, characters, storytelling, stuff like that. And to tell you, it did not disappoint. It did not disappoint in that area. However, there are some people that are questioning now whether or not we will see more horror-themed moments in the future MCU films. Like, will any future MCU film based on a property that has been known to kind of dabble in the horror, genre, in the comics, will it, surface in a future project? We've seen examples of this, in the streaming series, if you will. For example, we saw it in the What If series, with, the zombie episode. We've seen it somewhat in WandaVision. We kind of see it in Loki at times. The MCU has given us examples of horror-themed, situations. Even some of the deaths, some of the deaths in Avengers Infinity War, Endgame, some of the deaths in Age of Ultron, and even the first one are gruesome. They may not seem like that, looking back on it now, but they are. They are definitely gruesome to an extent. As well as there are other deaths and all that take place in other MCU films that kind of follow the same situation. However, they've never been to the horror elements thrown in there, I should say, have never been to the extent that we got now. I mean, you look at Far From Home, if you will, you look at Far From Home, and basically there's a scene in there where Mysterio creates this illusion for Peter that envisions him seeing Tony Stark in his Iron Man suit crawling out of his grave. As a zombie version. And that's the closest we ever got to a horror thing so far. Outside of some of the deaths that I mentioned previously, that's the only other horror thing we've gotten so far. Now, with the Venom films, that kind of have a very loose connection. The Venom films, the Morbius films and all that have a very loose connection somewhat to the MCU because of Spider-Man. You do see some horror elements in there as well. Now, mainly you see more horror elements or death or graphic deaths or whatever in those films because they're not necessarily under the Disney banner. They're under the Sony banner, and Sony's trying to do its own thing. But they have that loose connection, like I said, to where basically, it's still, what I'm trying to say is they have that loose connection still to where they still could be considered somewhat in the MCU. So the horror aspects that they have or inspired moments they have, could also be counted, if you will. But when we look at Doctor Strange, this was touted and promoted as basically the first straight up MCU film that was going to have big time horror moments, horror elements, horror scenes and all that. And like I said, it lived up to its reputation on that. I mean, some of the deaths of the Illuminati and stuff was just like, whoa, did not see that coming. Now, with all that said, and this being touted as one of the darker MCU films out there, with all that said, the question obviously is, again, Will we see more horror-themed moments, movies, elements thrown into the movies in future MCU projects? Will we see it? And I think if it's going to help emphasize what the story is about, help emphasize and describe and showcase how destructive and dangerous, let's say, the villain is or the villainess is of the film, then I would say yes. I would say the horror elements are definitely a necessity to do that. But if what John Campea said is true in his open spoiler discussion he did yesterday about a child giving his mom his Wanda figure, basically not wanting to have anything to do with it because of what he saw in the film, if something like that gets around, not only for what John saw coming out of the theater on Thursday, but probably elsewhere here in the country, if word gets out that something similar like that happened, in some other places, like I said, in other theaters, with people coming out with their kids, then yeah, that might too play a factor in the fact that we may not see horror elements anymore in MCU films in the future, or at least not for the time being after Doctor Strange. But that's all dependent if what John Campea described of what he saw coming out of the theater on Thursday after seeing the film, is, basically similarly echoed, I should say, throughout the rest of the country with their kids. But again, that's a wait and see kind of situation. But the way I look at it right now, as I said, I think if the story that you're trying to tell as an MCU film, if it's based on an already MCU property that you've done, or it's something new, then yeah, horror elements are needed. Horror-themed elements will be needed, especially if it's based on something that kind of devolves or kind of dives into that genre, if you will, to help tell its story through comic book media. So yeah, I think it is necessary. But again, it's all dependent on the reaction, on other reactions, I should say, of, possible kids coming out of the theaters. Because kids are going to want to see this film. We know that. It's Doctor Strange. It's Wanda. What could go wrong? And if what John Campea said, is echoed, like I said, identically across the country, then yeah, Kevin Feige may say, we ain't doing any more horror-themed like moments in these films for quite a while, or until, things clear up with this one. But that's just mere speculation. However, in my personal opinion, I think if the story needs a horror element or horror-themed situation or atmosphere to help tell its story, then yeah, I think horror elements are indeed needed, to do so. To, like I say, emphasize how much of a threat the villain or villainess is in that movie for the heroes and those involved. But what do you guys think? Do you think we'll see more horror elements in future MCU films and projects? Comment below, and I'm out.